Hello, everybody. So we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about Git. And if you've done any code-related things in the last several years, the odds are that you have encountered Git in one way or another, especially with here at GitHub. While you may or may not have used Git for version control yet, you've probably at least come here to GitHub or similar places to download someone else's code and use it for your own. Well, we're going to talk about the version control aspect of it and how you can really utilize that to manage your code. Now, if you're not familiar with version control, in the basic sense, it is a way to store your work and keep track of the history of it. It also allows you to do things like collaborate with other people in a much more efficient manner. You can go back in history and look at the changes you've made and even revert back to certain points of time in your code or your work. Now, there's a lot to Git. You can get very advanced with Git. In this series, we're going to look at the basic concepts, some basic workflows, and we're not going to focus totally or too in depth on the technical aspect, really just how you can get started with it. And some of the basic ideas behind it, so you get at least somewhat of an understanding of what's going on when you're using Git. Now, my first experience with version control was many years back with Subversion or SVN, and that was a different spin on version control, where you basically had one central repository, and anybody who wanted to work on that code checked out a copy of it, and then committed their changes back to the central repository. Now, I was very reluctant to start using Git, and I know a lot of people that were using older version control systems had the same feeling. There was a little bit of nervousness and confusion on how Git worked. Git, while you can definitely have a centralized repository, just like SVN, which is basically what GitHub does, you're also, instead of checking out just a copy of the files, you're actually taking an entire repository yourself. So when you clone, which is what they call it here with Git, when you actually clone a Git project, you have created your own repository locally on your machine or remotely if you're working on a server, etc. So you now have your own working repository, not just a download of the files. But there is a difference between cloning and just simply downloading from somewhere like GitHub. When you're downloading from GitHub, you're not really creating another repository. You're just grabbing the source code so you can use it. When you clone a repository, you've got your own repository that you can work with, make changes, and start working towards your own revisions and things like that. Another thing that Git does different than some of the older version control systems is Git remembers the changes to documents or to the repository as a whole, but only the changes. So some of the older ones, the older version control systems, when you made a change, say I was maybe just changing some text in one of the files, you've now made a copy of either at least that whole file or the entire system for just that little change. Whereas with Git remembers the location in that file and changes only that. It only remembers the little bit of information that you changed. So it makes it remarkably smaller. Before we get started, I want to talk about the environment we're going to work in here. Git is available for Mac, Windows, Linux, but we're going to work in kind of a hybrid fashion in a sense. We're going to be working on a Windows machine, but taking advantage of the Git Bash tool that comes with Git when you download Git onto your Windows machine, and that basically puts you in a Linux kind of command line environment. So we're going to be using that command line environment to work with Git. So you're going to need to brush up on a little bit of your Linux commands, but I'm also going to talk about some of the commands we're going to use. So if you're not familiar with that, with some of the command line stuff, We're going to go through that a little bit. If you are familiar, you can pretty much skip that video. Now, there are actually several GUIs made for Windows and Mac that allow you to use Git without having to use the command line. And I did that for a long time, but I found that I wasn't actually fully understanding what I was doing with those tools. And now, over the last year, I've gone 100% with the command line, and it's much better. I find it much easier. I have a whole new understanding of how it works and what I'm doing. So we're going to go with that method. And then if you choose, to use a GUI down the road, do you at least know what you're doing when you're taking advantage of that GUI? So really, all you're going to need for this series is you're going to want to download Git and install it for Windows or Mac. However, we're focusing on Windows, so I don't know what differences there may be for Mac. But you're going to go to the Git website, go to the downloads, find your download it, install it. Make sure, I believe there is an option to not include the Git bash utility. Make sure that you are including that because we're going to use that. The other thing I'm going to use Notepad++ for making changes to the code. You can do that if you're familiar with command line tools. You can do that too, but we're going to use Notepad++. You can use pretty much anything you want to use to edit the code. That's totally fine. So we're going to talk a little bit about command line